The second working group talking about funding and funding sources for a potential clean hydrogen economy in Connecticut. So today, just a few quick meeting logistics. We do request that folks mute your microphone if you're not talking. That just helps to prevent background noise. However, we really encourage active participation. There are tons of programs for which you all are the experts, and tons of areas where I know you all have expertise in terms of end use and infrastructure. So certainly appreciate and would encourage everyone's participation. And we do prefer, just for public record, that that is verbal. So feel free to raise your hand. There's a little raise hand function under reactions in your top bar. However, if you prefer not to share verbally or you're having trouble at all with Teams, there's also a chat function. So don't be alarmed if we read your chat out loud, word for word. That's simply for the public record. And just so everybody knows, we will be recording this meeting, and then it will be posted on the Connecticut Green Bank website. And another quick request, if you are speaking, we would love if you could state your name at the beginning of your comments for the public record. So today, a few things we'll be covering. Well, first we'll get to know who's in the room, and then we'll do a brief overview of the working group's objectives and provide an update on key areas of progress. We'll then dive a little bit deeper into areas of opportunity in the IIJA, and we'll dial into opportunities both in the hubs funding and beyond, because we did focus quite a bit on the hubs opportunity last month. We'll also talk about the match funding requirements for these federal sources of funding, and potential existing state funding sources that may be able to plug in and serve that need. And then we will also talk about examples of other states that are using funding programs that we may want to look at that could amplify Connecticut's competitiveness. Oops, looks like something got jumbled up. And then we'll chat about next steps. So before we get started, we'd love to hear who's in the room today. I know we have a small group, but a lot of folks will be, I'm sure, watching it after the fact. It's been a really busy time, especially in the world of hydrogen. So I'm just going to go down the line on my participant bar and call on folks. Starting off, well, I never got to really introduce myself. I'm Lily Backer. I'm a consultant at Stratagen, and I am project managing this working group. And then first on my list is Brian Farnan.
All right. Well, very excited to be here. I am the General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer for the Green Bank. I think I've been, besides Brian Garcia, who hired me, one of the longest tenured employees now at the Green Bank. And obviously, hydrogen and fuel cells are near and dear to our heart. And we're really excited to just see this as such a great opportunity to really bolster our state from a clean energy deployment and also a job creation perspective.
Thanks, Brian. Brian Garcia.
Brian Garcia, President and CEO of the Connecticut Green Bank.
Awesome. I have Erin Childs.
Good morning, everyone. Erin Childs, Director of Strategy and Consulting.
Thanks, Erin. Barbara Fernandez.
Barbara Fernandez, University of Connecticut.
Thanks for joining. Jennifer Gorman.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jennifer Gorman. I'm an analyst with Strategy Consulting.
Thanks, Jennifer. Kaya.
Good morning, everyone. It's Kaya here. I'm an analyst with Strategy.
Thanks, Kaya. Carmen.
Good morning, everyone. Carmen Molina Reyes with the Department of Economic and Community Deputy Commissioner.
Thanks for joining, Carmen. Your audio came through really quiet for me. I'm not sure if for anybody else. I could need, okay.
I'm
just
sorry.
flag. Oh, no, it's okay. I just wanted to flag in case you make comments later that I'm happy to test a new audio source for you. And Carmen's one of participating in our co-chair group. And then Nathan.
Yes, Nathan Froling, Director of External Affairs for the Nature Conservancy in Connecticut, and also oversee our climate and energy work. Happy to be here today.
Excellent, thank you. Shannon.
Hi everyone, I'm Shannon Lawn. I'm an attorney and the Connecticut State Director for Conservation Law Foundation.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. Sophia.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophia Browning. I'm with the law firm of Dave Pitney. We are providing support to the Green Bank Task Force.
Sridhar, and let me know if I pronounced your name incorrectly.
Yes.
So I get it right.
Yes, pretty good.
Sridhar.
So, hi, I'm Sridhar Kanuri. I'm Chief Technology Officer for HiAxiom. Just to put it in context, HiAxiom was previously Doosan Fuel Cell America, and prior to that, UTC Power.
Thank you. And Becca.
Yeah, hi everybody. Senior Policy Advisor at Connecticut Deep. I also know that Lydia Rupert will be joining us probably in the next 20-30 minutes from Connecticut Deep as well.
Wonderful. And Becca and Deep are also serving as co-chairs to this working group. Tyler Anderson. Tyler, if you're unmuting, we can't yet hear you, but feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to introduce yourself or introduce yourself via chat if you're having trouble with audio. All right, thank you, everybody. It's an awesome group. Oh, here's a member of the public. Okay, awesome. Thanks for joining. And just wanted to give a quick reminder as to who Strategen is and our role in this whole thing. We are supporting Connecticut Green Bank to run some of the meetings for the task force. We are handling meeting logistics. So if you want to add anyone to the meeting invites or make sure that you're plugged in, definitely we would be the people to reach out to. We also are coordinating with our awesome co-chairs to develop meeting agendas and the content for all of these sessions. We will also be providing some research and technical assistance. We're meeting monthly, so please join us for our next subsequent meetings. We'll also publicly post the recordings and minutes from these sessions. Just a quick reminder, especially for those who may be new, the Hydrogen Task Force was created to study the role of hydrogen-fueled energy in the state's economy and energy infrastructure. So after all of this, we'll be submitting a big report to the General Assembly that details findings from a bunch of the different working groups and recommendations. So we sit among 5 working groups. There are others on policy and workforce development, sources, infrastructure, and uses. So it is possible if things come up, we might say that fits better under another category of working group and sort of defer it to a colleague of mine. However, we'll definitely take notes, even if it's not quite in line with the funding working group, and pass that along. I also encourage people to get involved in any of the other working groups that interest them. So I can share the schedule for other working groups and happy to get you in touch with anybody to discuss the content of those groups. And so specifically at the funding working group, our statutory responsibilities, we have 3 specific assigned responsibilities. So an examination of how to position the state to take advantage of competitive incentives and programs from the IIJA, which we covered in the first working group, what that is and some of the different opportunities, and we'll dig a bit deeper today. I do encourage anybody who missed that one to feel free to take a look at the recording. We also are compiling recommendations for tax preferences for from the Targeted Brownfield Development Loan Program. We learned last month that there's actually quite a few different funding sources for brownfield redevelopment. And then finally, recommendations for other potential funding sources. So wanted to quickly walk through how we're interpreting those statutory responsibilities and also open it up for comment if other folks have different areas where they're interpreting their responsibilities. So in terms of how to take advantage of the competitive incentives in the IIJA, we're specifically looking to identify which ones are relevant for hydrogen and what it takes to qualify for those. We're then identifying which ones we might want to try to qualify for and dig a little bit deeper into how we can plug in. And then finally, which state resources can be applied to make Connecticut even more competitive for these funding sources. And skipping to the last one about what other sources may be available for hydrogen, we're also looking at what other state and federal funding sources can be tapped. And specifically, an area where we'd like to focus is the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has really awesome tax incentives and other great sources of potential funding. And then we've gotten some great recommendations on the manufacturing side, R&D side, and other federal programs that might be of interest to look into. So definitely recommend, or I'm open to recommendations of other areas where folks may think would be worth tapping into and researching about their applications for Connecticut. And just in terms of where we've been and where we'd like to go. So as I mentioned last time, we did a pretty comprehensive overview of the different brownfield programs in Connecticut. And then we also discussed some of the basics of the federal funding opportunities and participation requirements, really to set a baseline understanding of what's out there, what it takes to be eligible. Today, we'll dig a little bit deeper specifically on that IIJA mandate and ensure that we've discussed all potential avenues there. And then we'll discuss some hypotheses of where we might want to get started and share how others may be approaching being competitive for IIJA funding. And then next working group, I recommend that we narrow in on some of the other sources of funding. So that might be the IRA, the Buy America, federal funding sources. And then finally, I recommend in December that we go over what might go into this report and ensure that everybody's voices are heard in that process. So to start off, I just wanted to acknowledge that Benu from DECD did an excellent presentation last month on the various programs for brownfield remediation and redevelopment that may be able to be tapped into for hydrogen production and use. We'll be writing up the details of her awesome presentation and putting it into the report on the different opportunities. She really let us know that the funding goes beyond the loan program that's referenced in the legislation, but that there are awesome grants and liability relief programs. This type of work could cover a variety of remediation projects like consulting and engineering fees, hazardous waste disposal, demolition, asbestos abatement, really tons of different opportunity. So, and that loans could be up to $4 million. So there's a lot of great stuff to tap into there. And so the next step specifically on that area of the responsibilities of this working group, we are going to ask any outstanding questions of DECD on the potential ways we can leverage this program for hydrogen infrastructure and investment needs. We'll also explore any relevant incentives for developing brownfields. I know that there's a 10% adder incentive in the investment, sorry, that should say Inflation Reduction Act for repurposing brownfields for wind and solar projects. So we can certainly see where we can get even more strategic on brownfield redevelopment. And we'll also write up a detailed overview of Benu's presentation for the final report, and we welcome others to take a look at that.
Before you go on,
Oh yeah.
This is Barbara Fernandez. And in the previous slides, you were talking about next steps and DECD. One of the questions I want to ask is whether or not DCD is considering either amending or looking at their tax incentives. Because often when the state of Connecticut has tried to incent a new industry like hydrogen, for example, it has done through providing through DCD some tax credits for investment, or other things that will an example is, how the film industry grew in the state, largely because of tax investments. And the benefit to that incentive is that it is a pay as you go. So the state only pays out any incentives if the private entity or if the organization completes a project. So, so there's no upfront cost to it. It is based upon performance. So I'm wondering if DCD is considering that, because it's done that in the past when it wants to incent a new industry.
This is Carmen. Hi, Barbara. I think so. This is the working group. This is where we're looking for some ideas, right? And I think that then we would then come back and take some and just consider what's being discussed. I think those are some great points that I think, Lily, we should document and have some further conversations on what that makes sense, and is that a part of a recommendation or not?
Yeah,
that's wonderful. Maybe Strategen can provide us with some examples of other states that may have tax incentives to provide DCD, as Carmen said, so that they can look at some ideas that may cause them to think about things in a different way.
Right.
Awesome. And Jennifer will be going over a few examples of programs in other states. I'm not sure exactly, Jen, if any of them are specifically dialed in on those tax incentives.
Absolutely, Barbara. You kind of read our mind there. So we'll be diving into that later.
Yes, but we can, if that's a specific area of interest, we can dial in even further and see if there's other examples that we can pull from in addition to what we have today. So great dialogue. Thanks, everybody. Today, we want to focus on specific areas of opportunity for hydrogen within the IIJA. So I would like to invite my colleague Jennifer up to the virtual stage to discuss a little further about the general IIJA requirements for people seeking funding that we should keep in mind as we're considering these different opportunities, and also the existing Connecticut state funding and incentive landscape. And keep in mind, we know that you all are certainly experts on different programs in the state, and you've been working in and administering many of these for years. So we certainly recommend your or request your feedback if we've missed anything or if you have additional ideas. So Jen, I will turn it over to you. Let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Great. Well, I'm very happy to be here to talk a bit about IIJA requirements specifically related to funding. I know we've heard a lot of questions about what match funding is going to look like, especially for hydrogen hubs, but also for other IIJA opportunities. So we're going to dive a bit into that and also look at some potential existing funding opportunities that exist in Connecticut today. Next slide, please. So first, looking at the IIJA, I think folks in the room are aware of Justice 40, but the Biden administration has made it quite clear in both guidance and executive orders that energy projects that receive federal funding will need to demonstrate commitments to environmental justice and demonstrate how they minimize negative impacts on disadvantaged and tribal communities. This policy concern is abundantly present in the Hydrogen Hubs RFI, which does require a community benefits agreement and engagement with local communities. One of the requirements that a proposed hydrogen hub must meet to move into phase 2 of the selection process is that it has an equity, environmental, and energy justice strategy that includes significant and meaningful community engagement plans. Proposed hubs must also show that they have plans to ensure that environmental impacts on disadvantaged communities are minimized. The RFI has a non-exhaustive list of 8 environmental justice policies that will be high priority for consideration in funding hydrogen hubs. To briefly go through these include decreasing energy burdens, increasing the clean energy job pipeline and job training for individuals, and increasing energy democracy and community ownership of energy resources. So entities seeking funds from the Clean Hydrogen Hub program will need concrete plans for addressing these priorities to be competitive. Next slide. The DOE has developed a definition and tools to locate and identify disadvantaged communities to help states in their hydrogen hub proposals. Specifically, to be considered a disadvantaged community, a census tract must rank in the 80th percentile of the cumulative sum of 36 burden indicators and have at least 30% of households classified as low income. Tribal lands in U.S. territories are also categorized as disadvantaged communities. And the DOE has developed a very useful tool called the Energy Justice Mapping Tool, recognizing that this definition of disadvantaged communities may differ on the state level, but the federal definition is what's going to be very important for hydrogen hub proposals. Yes, Brian?
A couple of comments for the at the last task force meeting, we had Adrian Ferraro from the Greater Bridgeport Community Enterprises talk about Communities Leap in Bridgeport. They are being provided technical assistance for the DOE to do this local stakeholder process that will ultimately lead to a community benefit agreement. So very applied, one of 24 communities around the country that is the model in Connecticut. They aren't focused specifically on hydrogen. They're focused on what's important to their community. I think they're still determining that. So that's one point. The second is that Secretary Granholm, as you can imagine, and all across U.S. government leads are very serious about the Justice 40 initiative and are operationalizing it across all programs. So we see in the hubs, we will see in every proposal weighting towards whether or not Justice 40 is being pursued in your projects. I can tell you, and I will chat through the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board meetings. We had one the last couple of days. It's not up yet, but I will chat through the site where it will be. The Secretary did address Justice 40, and you can clearly see that it is a priority for her, meaning those proposals that are likely to be successful at the DOE have to address them. And the way it gets to there is by demonstrating a community benefits agreement. And I think Stratogen team, we've got in our next task force meeting, I think someone who's going to be talking about Connecticut's policy. We have Public Act 21-43 that talks about community benefit agreements. So I think we're going to have somebody, if I'm not mistaken. So just wanted to do some alignment there.
No, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Just for folks' awareness, at the last Policy and Workforce Development Working Group this month, we did have Aziz Dekan speak to that executive order about community benefit agreements and how it applies to fuel cell projects that are greater than 2 megawatts. So very important to understand what Connecticut has in place related to community benefit agreements and how this might play into the Hydrogen Hubs application. But Brian, thank you very much for calling out Bridgeport. Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford have been called out as disadvantaged communities. So these will be really important areas to focus and include and engage communities in terms of the Hydrogen Hubs proposal.
I do want to note that the Justice 40 would apply to other money, federal money as well. So not just the hubs chunk of money.
I think we can move on if there isn't further comment. Moving on to some IIJA match funding requirements. It's important to note that several, but not all IIJA opportunities require match funding. So the IIJA is much greater than the Hydrogen Hubs money, although that is quite significant. The Clean Hydrogen Hub specifically requires about a 50% match, which is some of the more significant match funding that you will see in the IIJA. The DOE has been pretty explicit about what sources can and can't qualify for this requirement. So what does qualify for cost sharing or match funding is third-party financing, state or local government funding or property donations, project participant funding, and donations of space and equipment. Sources including partial donations, any source of federal funding, and proceeds from prospective sales of an asset may not be utilized towards match funding requirements. And these requirements are consistent across IIJA opportunities. Next slide. On the state level, there are many options for match funding, and they're quite diverse and extensive. These sources may include funding from existing or potential hydrogen-related programs, funding from participating developers or even outside third parties, legislative appropriations and local government funding, and interestingly, donations of property or equipment from the government or participating partners are also eligible. Realistic sources for match funding are going to depend on the specific federal funding opportunity. So, for example, the Clean Hydrogen Hub solicitation is expected to fund at least 4 hubs with $8 billion over 5 years. So that's about $400 million per hub per year with an expected 50% match. So with this in mind, it's clear that match funding from maybe something like donations may not be sufficient. So for something like the Hydrogen Hubs opportunity, larger funding sources will need to be tapped and looked into. Next slide. With this in mind, Connecticut does have several existing hydrogen-specific funding and incentive opportunities, which may contribute to IIJA match funding options or just general market growth. These include the cheaper vehicle rebates and, of course, several Connecticut Green Bank programs, which have been authorized in statute. In addition, fuel cells are granted property tax exemptions. And also of note, the DECD commissioner is authorized to establish an economic development grant program to expand hydrogen and fuel cell industries. But it's important to recognize funding has not been appropriated to support this to date, but this could be an interesting place to look at for future development. Next slide. Samantha? Your hand.
I just had a question about connected to the source group and that identified solar as a fossil-free source for hydrogen. Would funding that goes towards solar development for the purpose of hydrogen production count in this funding match?
So you're saying grants that go to the solar that will produce hydrogen?
Correct.
That's a good question, Samantha.
Great question.
I'm not sure if anybody on the deep side has thoughts on that. I know that's a part of the cost of an overall hub is the production side.
Yeah.
So I would imagine it
Let
does.
me talk about it in a Connecticut context and see what our deep colleagues think. So let's imagine there's a competitive procurement for large scale solar, and there's a solar project in Connecticut that wins the long-term procurement for power and RECs, and that a portion or all of that solar production goes to hydrogen production. I guess that would be hard to do, right, Eric, when it's going back to the electric ratepayer. So that would be hard. That would be a funky case. Another one might be a behind the meter solar project. Let's say it's a 2 megawatt project that goes towards producing hydrogen. I would think in that case it would. You know, all of what ratepayers are paying for, I would assume, the tariff and the RECs would go towards the state match, because that is what state policy is doing. What do you think, Eric? Or somebody from
Sorry, guys, I just joined, so I lost the question. I was in a meeting, and I think Becca was here until a couple of minutes ago. We're just switching places because now she has a meeting. So I don't know what the question was.
I think, let me paraphrase Samantha. If there is solar development in Connecticut, and some of it or all of it is being used to produce hydrogen, could that development be considered part of the match here, in the context of a federal match? And what I was trying to do is to give an example of a policy in Connecticut, like the non-residential energy solutions program, where you might get, let's say, Hyaxium, that competes and wins a solar project, let's say 2 megawatts, and wants to locate it at their facility in South Windsor. And the production of the solar would go right into an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen. I would assume the entire tariff and RECs that they won in that auction would be the state match, but I'm not sure. That's kind of the question.
But are you talking about hydrogen in the context of hydrogen hub funding or something else? Because you said that using the solar to produce hydrogen, that's what you said, right?
Yeah, so in terms of a hub.
Yeah. In terms of the hub, what we can say is that if any part of the project is already funded by some other federal funding, that you cannot use this funding to the cost match. So if there is a federal funding for the solar, then this probably cannot be counted. I mean, this is how we are seeing from the answers that we get from DOE, and that there's a very, very small exceptions of little exceptions, a few exceptions, that you can use federal funding, another federal funding to the cost match. So if there's federal funding from some other part, that this cannot be used. Does this answer the question?
Kind of. Yeah, I think, Samantha, I can give a preliminary answer. We can fact check this, of course, and work with Dave Pitney to dive a little deeper. But I would guess that if you're doing dedicated solar for hydrogen production in a hub, that investment in that would count towards your match funding, but it would probably get more complicated if you're looking at more of a grid resource and incentivizing that. But Samantha, Joe, I see your hand.
Yeah, just thank you for the answer to that. And just to reiterate kind of how we think about this, you know, that great presentation that Colin did, and I think the sources committee showed how much solar, you know, could be generated in Connecticut, and given our statutory mandate to provide 100% zero carbon electricity supplied to the state, we really want to make sure that, like, our current load is addressed first, but, you know, where there are environmentally appropriate uses of hydrogen and solar can be used for it. And I want to make sure that we're thinking about how the funding mechanisms work there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, that's a really great call out. Thinking a bit upstream as well, not just incentivizing the hydrogen itself. So thank you.
You know, it's a key feedstock. So I definitely think that would be included in the total vision of what hydrogen production requires. And but we will double check and maybe collaborate with Dave Pitney on where there may be nuances into what solar funding both from private or state investment would go towards a federal funding match.
Absolutely. So I think we just have one more slide on this before we move into discussion. So I'll go quickly through this because everyone's making some great comments here. We just also wanted to point out, as Samantha brought up, funding opportunities that aren't necessarily hydrogen specific today may also be used to support the growth of the hydrogen economy. So, for example, there are some great Connecticut Green Bank programs, and I see that Brian added one to the chat, which is fantastic. And also DECD has some fantastic programs. We've already discussed the Brownfield program, but they also have manufacturing innovation apprenticeship programs and voucher programs, which may be able to provide hydrogen-related manufacturing with training or financial assistance. Also of note, a program that's pretty unique to Connecticut, PURA has recently established its regulatory sandbox program called the Innovative Energy Solutions, which provides $25 million in funding for third-party projects, utility projects, or partnerships to test and demonstrate innovative technologies. And this is expected to kick off in early 2023. So with all of this in mind, I'll hand it off to Lily to facilitate some discussion about Connecticut hydrogen funding opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And just at the forefront, is there anything you feel like we missed? I know Brian put an awesome opportunity in the chat, and then Jen mentioned the PURA opportunity. Anything from where anybody sits in the ecosystem that feels like it's missing? And to Samantha's good point, we can consider not just, end use of hydrogen, but really the entire value chain. Yes, I see your hand, Sridhar.
Yes, hi. I recently saw that there is specific microgrid related funding. Should we look into that and how microgrids with various generation sources and using that either for hydrogen or other use cases is an opportunity that we can also look at as an innovative technology?
Yeah, that's an awesome suggestion. Are you talking about microgrid funding at the state level?
No, I think it's at the federal level. It either came up with the IRA or IIJA. There's, I'll research a little more, and I can send you guys a link if I find something. I'll send you a link.
Fantastic. Yeah, next month we'll dive in a little deeper into the IRA opportunities and talk about other federal sources of funding. Specifically, now we're focusing in on state opportunities that could serve as match for IIJA and other funding opportunities that require a match from non-federal sources. But that I definitely want to tap into next month, focus a little more on. I see a hand from Nathan.
Yeah, this is interesting to see these many different possible avenues for putting the match together. And if I heard you, it was 400,000 a year is what we're looking at, right? It adds up to about 2 billion over the 5 years. Was the number of funding that's potentially available that we're looking at?
About 400 million per year, but that would be across the hub.
Right.
So
I do want to note, Jennifer, that they did say they were going to fund potentially more hubs, and I feel like the word on the street is that they may be more like $1 billion per hub. So
of course,
but
so that's a maximum.
That would be spread across. Yeah.
So with those numbers in mind, my question is, and with looking at these potential opportunities for match, is it your intention to make an even qualified estimate of whether we come anywhere close to our potential funding for the hub? It's great to see all the possibilities, but if we start adding up the pennies and the dimes, do we get to $1 or we just get to 25 cents?
I would love to hear specifically from the folks who administer these programs, like what kind of funding's within them. So definitely I welcome folks to chime in, especially on subsequent slides. We're going to focus on what it looks like to match up those opportunities. So definitely I would like to dig into how realistic these sources are, but also note that at least Deep can step in wherever. but that this is a part of a larger regional effort, at least for the H2 Hubs application. So it could support the larger hub, and it could be Connecticut's contribution from a state level.
That's great. Thank you.
Not sure if anyone has anything to add on that.
This is Brian. I can add on it and let's see if this, so let's just take a 1 megawatt of fuel cells as an example that wins underneath the NRES program or other competitive solicitation, shared clean energy facilities. We see lots of fuel cells going in, delivering more subscriber savings to low-income families there. So let's say a megawatt of fuel cells wins at 10 cents. I don't know what the pricing is, but let's say they win at 10 cents. You know, that's $800,000 a year going from ratepayers to that fuel cell project times 20 years. You start adding that up, that gets to pretty significant leverage quickly. You know, that's just 1 megawatt. So I think Sridhar and or our utility colleagues will want to get our arms around what the tariff rates are shaking out to be for fuel cells in the various programs to get at what ratepayers are paying for fuel cell deployment, either behind the meter or front of the meter.
That's really helpful, and that's also encouraging, I would think.
I'm not sure if these are new or old hands. I see Barbara's hand up.
Yes, my question is related more to Brian. So one of the challenges that I've seen is funding for these early stage developments. A lot of the funding is for implementation, right? These are proven models that are in the implementation. And so like the hydrogen hub, for example, it's all implementation, nothing under TRL 9. So much of what's coming up are some of the, more underdeveloped, concepts. And I'm wondering, and we've in the state have always had a problem with developing a fund that mixes state money with private money, right? And so in my fantasy world, I would love to see us develop a program, maybe under the Green Bank, where we can, as a state, fund these very early stage developments, these projects that are maybe TRL 4 or 5, and they're just on the verge of getting into that proven model, because I think that would benefit the state, and it will also benefit the creation of new companies. I'm just asking Brian if that's a possibility.
Forgive me, Barb. I think the new company route is, depending on where you're going in the hub, I think a CI investment as an example in a company. Let's just take Proton, which is now Nel Hydrogen in its early days. I think if there were a Connecticut investment in that company that led to a project, I think that could count. It can't be for early stage research, is my understanding, in the hub context.
Now, the hub is not for early stage research. And I mean, I'm not talking about the hub, Brian. I'm talking about moving forward out of the hub conversation, and saying that CI is interesting. I didn't think about CI. But, you mentioned the MIF in one of the other slides. One of the things the state did do is put together a pot of money, 75 million, to fund manufacturers, right? And it has led to some significant leveraging that 75 million, and Carmen would talk to you about it, has been 3 or 4 times leveraged by private companies. So I'm just thinking about if we want to help these early stage companies, they come from, sometimes academia, sometimes outside, they do need funding, and they need funding that allows them to leverage their private funds with state funds.
Yeah, I think determining where in the cycle, what agency is it, CI, DECD? It's not the Green Bank. We don't do early stage stuff. But I don't see why not if there was a competitive reason to do it. I think it kind of gets back to your tax credit question with DECD and Carmen. Is it a priority industry? That's probably something to flag.
Okay, like I said, just an idea. Thank you.
May I just jump in just to clarify one small thing? The hub, you can be in earlier stages. You can be under TRL 8 before the completion of phase 4. You have to be on or more the TRL 8 when phase 4 is finished. So this is 8 to 12 years after the hub has started. Of course, if companies cannot make to TRL 8 by this time, they are out of the hub funding opportunity. But there is some space for earlier stages to be in this process.
In the interest of time, I do want to move forward, but that's certainly something we can capture in the report as a potential opportunity to encourage innovation and specifically in Connecticut. Alrighty. Jen, did you have anything more to add on this slide? I just want to make sure.
No, I think we're ready to.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Jump.
All right. So with that, I just want to quickly summarize all of the awesome stuff Jennifer shared. So in order to be really competitive for IIJA funding, even outside of the hub's opportunity, Connecticut should certainly identify opportunities to create benefit for environmental justice communities. A potential next step here is we should summarize the key takeaways from the conversation with Bridgeport and potentially consider including those in our report. And they noted specifically that some areas that are needed are to develop criteria to identify community impacts, and specifically Adrian noted a need for funding for community engagement. So we could potentially wrap findings from those conversations into our report on the funding side. Let's see, and then the second thing that we know is important to be competitive for IIJA funding is determining opportunities for state level match funding. So that's what we're going to dig into a little bit more today. And thanks for the awesome conversation so far on this. And finally, we should seek to further support targeted areas that are identified in the sources, infrastructure, and end uses with incentives and funding. So more on that will be revealed in the coming months as those analyses get more and more baked, but just want to keep those in mind as we continue moving forward. Alrighty. So as I noted, today we'll focus on some of the areas of opportunity for hydrogen in the IIJA, and specifically we'll talk about the hub's opportunity and beyond, and different areas where Connecticut could really take seriously and potentially be really competitive for. And then we can start forming some predictions or recommendations for how potential state funding could provide match funding for these opportunities. Starting off, I did just want to note a few of the primary end uses that are being discussed in the uses workstream. Don't want to get too deep into this, but just wanted to reference the conversation going on in one of the other working groups, which may be helpful as we're looking at potential focus areas where Connecticut could match up funding opportunities with end use opportunities in Connecticut. Brian, I see your hand.
There's another raise. You probably can't Shannon's hand raised
Oh,
because it's
sorry.
a queue, but there may be questions. So if you could look at your
Oh,
queue.
yes. Okay, awesome. Shannon, was there another question? Oh, I see your note. Thank you. Shannon, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I've been waiting for a little while. This is sort of
I'm
a general
sorry.
question. No, that's fine. Yeah, this is sort of a general funding question regarding or increased transparency around the availability of the federal funding. I was wondering if there are any plans on the part of DEEP or the Green Bank, or perhaps together, to have any like public-facing resources about the available federal funding, and then going forward, the status. So for example, like what funding Connecticut is applying for, what is eventually awarded, and then in the implementation phase, how that money is being spent. Because I think there's a lot of interest, but it's hard to kind of parse out everything that's available, both for hydrogen, and then of course there's a whole lot of other funding available as well. So sort of a general question about whether there would be public-facing resources where people could get a better handle on the status of things.
Yeah, this is a good idea, Shannon. Maybe, I mean, we don't have right now any channel that compiles everything. I mean, maybe a web page or something that compiles all the funding resources that we are working with. But that's a good idea. Maybe this is something that we could work on. On the hydrogen specific side, we are about to release a web page that compiles all the initiatives, all the ongoing work that we are doing, and the funding opportunities that appear in this realm will be there. As soon as it is out, we are going to publicize it. So at least regarding hydrogen, we'll get that covered. But regarding all of the others, that's something that we can think about doing. Thank you for pointing out.
Shannon.
I guess what I could add is, yeah, given all the other opportunities and the requests for information out there, not that we have committed to applying for them, but we have submitted public comments into the various agencies on them. Like, I'm happy to Strategen team forward you, and you can post on our website the various RFIs that we filed into the various agencies so folks can take a look. Again, that's not saying that we're going to be applying for it, but the key one that we're going to be focusing on is the National Climate Bank elements of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that the EPA has. That's modeled after the Connecticut Green Bank. So that has become our #1 priority. So we will be coordinating amongst Connecticut for a fantastic application for those funds. But I'll send that through Lily, and we can get those posted.
We'll dive right in. So there are some of what we discussed in working group 1 was the regional clean hydrogen hubs opportunity, for which the FOA has been released, and I know folks across the country are working on applications. There are a few different hydrogen specific provisions in the IIJA. There's the clean hydrogen hubs. There's also money for clean hydrogen technology manufacturing and recycling, RD&D, and electrolysis research. And so starting off with the hubs opportunity, I won't go too much into detail because we discussed it a lot last time, and also I know Jen touched on it. But I wanted to have a quick back and forth about potential sources of funding that the state may be able to provide. So the funding that's available in this and in the funding opportunity announcement that was recently released is $7 billion. And then, as noted, the government does plan to fund 6 to 10 hubs. So it's expected each hub, from the latest I've heard, will get approximately $1 billion. And the match requirement, as Jennifer noted, is a bit higher for this. I know that it's important to the federal government that these are durable, long-term investments that will withstand. And so I wanted to compile some of the different resources that we think could potentially be applied from a state level. So the CPACE money, I'm definitely curious to hear from Brian or others from Connecticut Green Bank. I noticed a potential end use application for hydrogen that was considered as critical facilities. I'm wondering, is that something that this money could be used for?
So depends on what kind of critical facilities. In general, critical facilities are predominantly public facilities. Maybe not all, but let's just hang out there for a second. So if they are, then historically they would be financed through probably a combination of the deep microgrid grants, the behind the meter LREC or NRES program currently. But right now, because IRA, you can do direct payment or transfer investment tax credits for public entities. I think we would probably start to see more hospitals, maybe affordable housing, doing fuel cell projects for, I'm defining affordable housing as a critical facility only because there's a lot of residents there. But I think we'd probably want to break that critical facility definition up into its components, and where CPACE can apply, obviously, is for profit. But there are some now nonprofits that can benefit given the new tax treatment. Brian, if you wanted to add anything there on that.
No, I mean, obviously, the tax treatment is going to be a huge benefit for us with, for it.
Got it. All right. And just moving down the list, we have our brownfield programs. A thought on where this could be applicable specifically for land and acquiring land for green hydrogen projects, but also potentially for some of that pre-construction needs, seeing that you are able to do that remediation process. It wouldn't, the financing or grants for brownfields redevelopment would not actually go towards the project costs of developing a green hydrogen project, but there may be minor areas. I'm not sure, Carmen, if you have any thoughts on that, to where it could be helpful. And certainly, go ahead.
At the project level, clearly, and I think we can dig a little deeper too to understand what that would look like with Benita site on that. Clearly at the project level.
Got it. I think I captured what you said, but it is still a little quiet. So if you have if you want to write in the chat too. Oh no, you're okay. I'm sorry.
Internet issues and audio issues at the same time. So
oh no, I'm sorry. And then another area that we identified is the Innovative Energy Solutions Program. So it provides this demonstration project money, and so that could be a potential interesting source if anybody wants to add anything on potential applications for that funding. Happy to pause there. And then Brian, you've mentioned NRES and then the Shared Clean Energy Facility Program and their tariff options. I want to double check and potentially work with some of my lawyer friends on what the nuances are around tariffs as match funding. But definitely I saw, Brian, you put some thoughts in the chat that we can revisit on how that could work out.
Yeah, I think if we got that breakdown on the low emission renewable energy credits, the last 10 years of that in the fuel cells that came through there from High Axiom, Fuel Cell Energy, and Bloom, along with the associated LREC price over a 15-year period, we would get the state match dollar underneath that prior period as an example. Today, the non-residential energy solutions program is different. It's not a REC-based program, but it's a 20-year tariff NREC program. So if we can get from the utilities what the NRES and SCEF, Shared Clean Energy Facilities, Avangrid has a number of community solar, what people call community solar in Connecticut. We're agnostic to the technology. That are fuel cell projects, we can then get a sense of what's the SCEF price and get a sense of what the ratepayers are paying. So that's what I'm kind of getting with that question. So we probably reach out to our natural gas and electric utility colleagues on this task force to get us information.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting, just as a means of quantifying what that potential funding source could look like. And I know that was something I believe Nathan, you mentioned, was like actually getting down to some dollars and cents around what this what the funding sources could mean. Does anybody have other programs that they are aware of or would like to see considered as a source of match funding for regional clean hydrogen hubs? So that could be the entire value chain of green hydrogen, or sorry, clean hydrogen. All right. So another specific area for that points directly towards hydrogen in the IIJA is this electrolysis research, development, and demonstration funding. This is actually an expansion of a DOE's existing program. Its purpose is to demonstrate technologies to produce clean hydrogen using electrolyzers and to validate information on the cost, efficiency, and durability and feasibility of commercial deployment. So industry partners are recipients here. I would love anybody who's super familiar with the PURA program to note if this is a potentially relevant source of match funding, but that's one that I identified that could be a good fit. And just to note that the application opening date should be coming out pretty soon. And there's going to be 1 billion total. Hopefully we'll learn a little bit more when that application comes out, how much is expected to go to each participant.
So this is Brian. I would add what I know about the program, which is that the utilities, both Eversource and Avangrid, as well as third parties, are going to be invited to submit proposals into IES. The utilities can submit proposals independently. I think PURA established a no less than 3 proposal target for the utilities. They could submit in partnership with third parties, or third parties can submit independently. So our utility colleagues in the task force could submit into IES a hydrogen project if they wanted to for whatever reason, as long as it met whatever IES is after. And I do believe there's going to be some sort of benefit cost assessment of the projects that would be, or programs that would be supported through the IES. So I think it's an option, but people have to submit projects in to that process when it opens.
Yeah, the project's going to start next year.
Got it. Sounds good. Thank you. So we'll have to look and make sure, because many of these funding opportunities, they are coming in like tranches. So if there's an additional tranche next year, that could be a relevant source. Shannon, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Just one more thing to add. I believe that there is a $5 million cap on individual projects under the Innovative Energy Solutions Program. And I can link to their PURA's decision document in that.
Thank you. 5 million is pretty sizable. Thank you for that. Nathan, I see your hand too.
Yeah, could you go back to the slide just before this? I just realized I had a question about the
Oh, yeah.
timing of,
Yes.
let's see, what does it say? Concept papers due November 7th. That's not too far away. I'm just wondering, what do we have to say about the timing there?
So the concept, I can definitely hand it over to if the folks at Deep have
Well, we can-
anything to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lily. All we can say is that we are working very hard and we will submit by the timeline.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's
It's important to note that the concept paper is really just a concept, so it's at
Ye-
the higher.
Yeah, I mean, there's the limit of the concept paper. It's in the forward this information. It's at a 20-page. There's a 20-page limit, so there is no large details on the concept. And after this concept paper in December, DOE will give a sort of a go no go. It's not go no go because everybody can still apply, but it's encourage and discourage notification to applicants, and then we have the full application due on April 2nd. But yeah, we are working hard, and the timeline will be achieved.
This is Barbara
Thank you.
Fernandez. I can also add that from the project submitters, the concept paper, the redacted version is now on the NYSERDA SharePoint, so we're reviewing that. The unredacted concept paper will be sent out tomorrow to the project applicants, and all of us have been given until Friday to submit to NYSERDA on their SharePoint our feedback on the concept paper. So everyone, as I said, is working diligently to read the documents, making comments on, there's an Excel spreadsheet, and then submitting that to NYSERDA by Friday at 7 p.m.
In the interest of time, I might kind of move quickly through some of these so that we can ensure we get to the portion where Jennifer shares some of the activities going on in other states that might be useful to reference. But I did just want to briefly touch on the clean hydrogen manufacturing and clean hydrogen recycling RD&D money, which I think could be a potential area where Connecticut could shine. There was a recent RFI that sought to gather information on potential new manufacturing technologies for clean hydrogen production and processing, delivery, storage, and use equipment, including fuel cells. So the eligible uses of this funding are listed here. This is specifically around the recycling portion. So there could be some really great opportunities to plug in. And one of the sources of funding that I identified was this wonderful manufacturing voucher from DECD that could be really appropriate for this application. Hey, Carmen. I would love to hear your thoughts as well on this program's applicability.
In regards to the voucher program itself, it is project-based at company level, so it is smaller scale. The Manufacturing Innovation Fund does have the authorization to match federal dollars at a program level. So in the broader sense, I think that I would just list it as the Manufacturing Innovation Fund, not so much voucher program, because the voucher program is at the company level and it's smaller scale.
That is super helpful. So there is sort of a fund generally that could be match funding, and then this specific program is a little more too nuanced. Maybe we want to zoom out in a recommendation.
Yeah, it has the authorization to do that. It would need to go through some approval processes, but I'm saying, just identify the fund versus the voucher program itself.
Got it.
That
All right.
Transactional and smaller.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Hey, Brian.
Hey, just following up on Samantha's question earlier on transparency or just like so folks know what's happening. So when we come up with this table of the IIJA opportunities, some of them will have passed, meaning their windows for submitting RFPs may have already passed. So what we may flag is to just reach out to our Connecticut Hydrogen Fuel Cell Coalition colleagues at the manufacturing companies and maybe the utilities to see if, and UConn for that matter, to see who's submitting what and where. I think that would be useful for the legislature to see where there are opportunities and where people are submitting applications.
Mm. That can certainly be captured in our report as well. Opportunities for greater funding transparency. I also just wanted to quickly touch on that there are tons of opportunities that could be potentially applicable for hydrogen that aren't necessarily noted as hydrogen opportunities. So just wanted to flip through a few other applicable IIJA provisions, but I'm just going to spend 5 minutes because I do really want to make sure that we can talk about some of the practices going on in other states. So there are tons of different transportation related provisions. So there's a low or no emissions bus grant. It may be possible that we could use this for transit depot, for fueling for buses, if there are potentially long range buses as identified as a priority. This could be a source of funding, and the federal share is actually much higher for some of these provisions, between 80 and 90% for certain funding areas. And something that I think is pretty cool about this program is there's you can request an additional 0.5% for workforce development training for these new fuel cell equipment or buses. So I think that could be a really cool opportunity. There is also a clean school bus program if there are certain routes that the range would be preferable for fuel cells, just something to keep in mind. There is also a reduction of truck emissions at port facilities funding tranche. This, I believe, is not specifically for heavy duty trucks, but maybe equipment that could be facilitate greater efficiency and thus reduce port-related emissions. So that could potentially be utilized in terms of fuel cell equipment at a port, like maybe really efficient top handlers or things like that. There's also a great electric or low emitting, sorry for my dog, low emitting ferry program. So there has been a pilot project. Oh, hang on one moment. There was a pilot project in California that could serve as an example of what's possible for fuel cell ferries. But I know that there are ferry routes out of Connecticut that may be potential applications for this funding. There are also more general funding opportunities around research, development, demonstration, and deployment. I'd like to understand whether this could be used potentially for rail projects, which was identified as an end use that could potentially fit in Connecticut's economy. And I also wanted to note that there are charging and fueling infrastructure grants, and this could potentially support with deployment of infrastructure that would support hydrogen for heavy duty trucking. I think that there are certain ways that maybe we could be creative about methods to deploy state funding sources for the land for stations, for example, or for maybe repurposing land, specifically that was a brownfield, could be a cool idea. But I would certainly be open to transportation related funding areas recommended by folks on the call. And it's important to note a lot of the ones that I just mentioned are specifically with regard to, or specifically are available to transit agencies and other state municipal bodies. Let's see. Moving forward, there's also an industrial emissions demonstration project fund, but I am not sure if there's specific applications that folks can imagine in Connecticut that might be a good fit for this type of funding. So certainly welcome those with deeper engagement in the Connecticut economy and businesses to comment there. I know we just flew through this in the interest of time, but I did want to touch on which programs that folks on the call think may be really great areas for Connecticut to focus on for additional funding areas outside of that HUBS funding. And then did we miss any areas of state funding that could serve as match for things like the fueling stations or buses or opportunities that have come up that do require some, although it's lighter, it's about a 20% cost share requirement for recipients, but it still does require some funding. Did you gather any comments here?
I was just gonna say, not a fully fleshed out thought, but given what's happening in the other uses working group around identifying those end uses very systematically and kind of foundationally, scientifically, however they're doing it, that aligning all the different state and federal sources of funding and financing to that list, connecting the two. I don't know visually how to do it in a table or what, but there's something there.
Yeah, that was something, and that's why I sort of flashed that up at the beginning of the call, because I do think those give us indication of where we may want to focus. So there was on that list, I believe it was framed as long haul buses. So for those longer trips, and I'd love to chat with Colin about those applications that might be the best fit. There was definitely trucking on that list, critical facilities. So certainly might make sense to dial in a bit further on funding that relates to those areas. I see two hands up. Sridhar, you're up first.
Yeah, so I don't know if it is a question, comment, or thoughts that I'm going to be rambling out. So with Connecticut being in between two busy cities, Boston and New York, and the amount of transportation that happens, we at least internally at High Axiom have been thinking of potential uses of the product we make. And you can, we're doing a demonstration of this in Korea, but we could take our power plant that feeds off natural gas and take a slipstream of hydrogen from it, use it for hydrogen infrastructure development. And at the same time, this power plant can also do the electrical infrastructure part of it, where it is tied to the grid and do EV charging. So both EV charging and hydrogen fueling is a concept that we have recently put out as a demo in Korea. And I think as part of this various funding initiatives, it might be a concept that we could propose, but I'm not quite sure if this is the right forum to discuss, or I can for sure discuss with folks offline.
Thank you for that comment. I'm not sure if that would fit better within the end uses and infrastructure conversations, but I definitely want to capture that thought, and I would love to circle back on that. Specifically, but thank you for that idea. Nathan, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I hope I can say this succinctly. I'm wanting to get at the tension or the challenge that exists between trying to identify those end uses and or sources that are most suitable We talked about this yesterday in the working group yesterday, between, you know, most suitable versus not wanting to foreclose on any possible end use for a loan fund, right? So that same filter comes into play with this question of which programs do we think are most suitable for funding? Because if we put the slate out there that says there's, you know, 35 programs with the implication that they're all equal, is that what we want to do, or do we want to try to also add some discrimination in terms of what we think may be more suitable, either from a practical point of view or from a clean energy future point of view?
That's a really interesting. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. Go ahead.
No, that's a really good point. And I was actually talking to Brian about this before everyone joined, is like what the final report could look like. Is it more of a kitchen sink of everything that's out there, or is it a little bit more targeted? And we definitely welcome folks' views on that. We'll talk a little bit more about what the final report might look like in a few months, but I think we were leaning towards providing all of that context of just all of the opportunities out there, but maybe pointing our recommendations towards where we see things headed in other work streams.
Great. Well, thanks so much for hearing and understanding and already having the same thoughts yourself.
No, it's a good time. We're excited to explore it further.
And it's good that you're in both, Nathan, so you could see the connections between the so we're really going to have to try to resolve that, because to your point, there may be some prioritization opportunities, and if there are, because you're trying to seed an area that is a competitive advantage to Connecticut, then you want to focus state policy and resources to that so we can be more competitive at. Yeah. It's a very subtle, nuanced, but right on point.
Yeah, let's definitely chat about this. I see a hand up from Carmen. I think, okay.
Really quickly, I just want to confirm, it's interesting. I was writing competitive advantage as Brian was saying it, right? So I think that, us being sure that we highlight and focus on where Connecticut's competitive advantages is important in those recommendations, so that policy can reflect that, and we can really invest in that area. So in total agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, that may be the guidance, Carmen, that DECD needs in terms of the preferential treatment of certain tax credits that you and Barbara were talking about. Yeah.
Right.
That industry feedback, because you can't do it all, but whatever the group will decide on, whether it's strengthening its strengths or lifting its weaknesses or whatever, but we definitely have an opportunity in Connecticut.
I do want to spend the last 5 minutes just providing a few examples of potential state level funding programs that could amplify Connecticut's competitiveness. And Jennifer actually put these together, so I'll invite her to share these thoughts with you. Sridhar, is that an old hand or new hand? I just want to make sure I got all comments.
Oh, sorry, it was an old hand.
No worries, I'll lower it. All right. Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. All right. Well, as we were talking about earlier, as the topic of hydrogen has been emerging across the country, we've been seeing a ton of hydrogen-related bills that have passed. Specifically, over the past 3 years, we've seen 120 bills related to hydrogen, and about a third of these were actually related to clean, green, or renewable hydrogen. In general, we've seen that these bills usually focus on a particular end use, interestingly, such as mobility, industry, or the gas and electric sector, among others. And mobility has been by far the most common hydrogen-related bill subject that we've seen. So in the next 2 slides, I'll provide a brief overview of examples of hydrogen-specific incentives and funding that's been emerging in other states. And I just want to make it clear that just because something doesn't exist in a different state doesn't mean that Connecticut can't do it, but these are just some high-level examples. Examples of hydrogen incentives that we've seen that have emerged in multiple states are tax exemptions for alternative fuel vehicles and their purchase and distribution. We've also seen income tax credits for zero-emission vehicles, tax exemptions for facilities that produce or use green hydrogen, also tax exemptions for labor and services related to the installation and construction of fuel cell infrastructure. and tax deferrals for certain project investments that are related to hydrogen. And an emergent area of focus are electrolytic green hydrogen tariffs that make grid electricity cheaper to use in an electrolyzer. Shannon?
Hi, thanks for running through these examples. I was just wondering if you'd be able to provide the statutory citations to these so folks could see the language.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can update this slide with the specific statute when we upload.
That's a great idea. Thank you, Shannon. Barbara.
Yes, the question around the tax exemptions for facilities that produce or use green hydrogen, are those tax exemptions for private, like corporate facilities that use green hydrogen? Or is there a carve out for any specific group?
No, it's just a broad a facility that produces or uses. I think this is pretty focused on the industrial sector, but we'll link the statutory language. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I see a hand from Samantha as well.
Yeah, hi. Just want to lift up Shannon's request for the actual statutes and piggyback on Nathan's comment. You know, I think we need to move with extreme caution here because we want to make sure that we're not, we know what our priorities are and are not incentivizing things that are potentially harmful because, you know, hydrogen, some hydrogen production actually increases greenhouse gases. Some hydrogen use, like in power plants, has shown to increase NOx emission, and we don't want to harm environmental justice communities or eviscerate our greenhouse gas reduction targets by, you know, by moving forward with incentives that have the potential to do that harm. So yeah, I'm feeling very cautious as we talk about this.
No, absolutely. And I just want to make it clear, these aren't necessarily recommendations for Connecticut, but just, you know, looking at what has been done just for some food for thought. But that's heard, Samantha, and thank you for your comments. I think we can go to the next slide very briefly. Beyond incentives, which usually focus on tax credits or deferrals, we've also seen, you know, a bunch of grants and loans provided for hydrogen-related activities. So these can focus on refueling infrastructure development, renewable development that's paired with hydrogen production, grants for industrial and manufacturing decarbonization, grants for innovative hydrogen use in the maritime sector, and funding for RD&D. So, you know, there's a broad spectrum of how one can incentivize and fund clean hydrogen operations. So again, these are just some food for thought for what Connecticut can do moving forward. But I'll hand it back to Lily.
Thank you, Jennifer. I do know we're about at time. I would love to invite folks to comment maybe in the chat as we're closing out on specific areas that may benefit from financial support. I know that's a loaded question given the comments that have just been shared.
Barbara has a question.
Oh yeah, and Barbara, I see your hand up. I'm not sure if it's a new hand. You're muted, just in case you are sharing. Well, if you're having trouble unmuting, feel free to share your comment in the chat. And thank you for that, Lydia. So continuing forward, just in terms of next steps, we have so much food for thought from this awesome participation today. So thank you so much for your engagement. That's what makes this a really meaningful process. We will be taking some of that and processing it to figure out what the next steps might be, specifically with relation to IIJA, potential sources of state funding and potential programs. I also wanted to note that next time we will plan to focus in a bit further on areas of non-IIJA funding, and just wanted to flash up the working group meeting schedule so that you can get engaged both in ours, or if you're curious to chat more about end uses and policy, those are great places to engage. Brian, I see, and Barbara, if you want to share your final thoughts after Brian, I invite you as well.
Yeah, coming back to the competitive advantage question a little bit, and maybe we'll see more of it in the IRA with regards to the credits. But at the last task force meeting, Fuel Cell Energy hosted us, and at the staff of Fuel Cell Energy made it very clear that I think it was greater than 80% of all the components and parts are made in America. So that part will be a real big lift for Fuel Cell Energy projects, not only in Connecticut, across the country. So when we think about aligning state incentives to reinforce made in Connecticut, deployed in Connecticut, but also deployed other places, there are some of those macro IRA things that come in, along with all the other apprenticeships, workforce development, energy communities, all the interesting adders in there.
Thank you. All right. Well, any further comments before we adjourn, or questions about where we are going for our next meeting? Okay. With that, we are a few minutes over time, so I will end the recording.